For the last video that we're doing on ecosystem ecology, we're going to be looking at the nutrient cycles. Now, I mentioned it previously in the last video, just very briefly, but we're going to go into a few of the different nutrients that cycle around. In the last video, I mentioned that there's a finite number of atoms. However, we can recycle them. So these atoms are going to cycle through being broken down, made into different types of molecules, broken down again, made into new molecules over and over and over again. And the first cycle we're going to look at is carbon. So carbon is found pretty much everywhere, in the oceans, the atmosphere, terrestrial organisms, and in fossil deposits. And burning fossil fuels has been adding a significant amount of carbon into the atmosphere. We know that our CO2 content now is the highest it's been in about 500,000 years, so 500,000 years. And so we do know this because we can see what they do is they take ice cores and they can actually analyze those and see how the atmosphere was going back in time, because that ice, that air gets trapped, that atmosphere gets trapped within the polar ice at various levels, right? And so we can analyze the atmosphere in those ice cores and look at how has the atmosphere changed over time. And so what we see is that in the newer ice that's up towards the top, there's much more CO2 content than if you go deeper down with the older ice. Now, nitrogen is mainly found in the atmosphere. We'll also go into the nitrogen cycle. And when we look at nitrogen, it's an extremely important atom or an element, because every single amino acid and every single protein that you have in your body and that every other living thing has in its body, every amino acid has at least one atom of nitrogen. So it's extremely important, it's absolutely vital for living things. Because every single cell in your body, in your friends' bodies, in your pets, every single living thing, every cell has thousands of proteins that can be thousands of amino acids long. And so you're looking at a very important, very necessary element. Now, is nitrogen usable in every form? No. Nitrogen gas, or N2, cannot be used by plants. But NH3, which is also known as ammonia, can be. And so one of the things that plants and fungi will do, or plants and bacteria will do, is that they will have bacteria that will fix nitrogen, basically pulling the nitrogen gas from the air, fixing it into NH3, and then allowing the plants to use it. So there's a symbiotic relationship there between plants and things like fungi and bacteria for this purpose. So let's go ahead and look at the carbon cycle. This is one that's extremely important and very relevant today because we have upset this cycle. Under normal circumstances, plants will use the carbon from carbon dioxide and the light energy to build sugars, which are carbon-based, through photosynthesis. And that carbon will move through the food chain as the organisms eat the plants, and then those organisms get eaten by other animals, and then each level of those organisms can extract the energy from the carbon bonds, basically breaking down the glucose, breaking down the carbohydrates, using that carbon to build up other molecules, or exhaling it back into the atmosphere as a byproduct of cellular respiration. Now, when a large number of organisms die, that carbon will accumulate in the ground. If it stays there long enough and under the right conditions, the organic remains can be transformed into coal, oil, or natural gas. But it takes a really long time for that process to happen, for organisms to basically be put under this high amount of pressure under these very particular circumstances. We're talking millions of years to become things like coal, oil, or natural gas. In today's world, we're burning coal, oil, and natural gas, and that's putting carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, but it's doing so at a faster rate than the producers can handle. So we're adding in more carbon dioxide than we are able to extract. And that's the disruption of the carbon cycle we're seeing today. Under normal circumstances, organisms would die, these things would maybe be trapped there, at some point they might be released, and over time, things would stay balanced. But since we are extracting these fossil fuels, these non-renewable resources, and burning them much faster than they're ever going to be produced, we're disrupting that carbon cycle. With the nitrogen cycle, this is another cycle that we have somewhat disrupted as well. But let's talk about what it looks like normally. So nitrogen gas is found within the atmosphere, and it's in a form that is not usable by most living things, including the plants. So it's pretty much unusable for most organisms, most living things. It takes soil-dwelling bacteria to capture that and fix it, basically transform it into ammonia, as well as other things that have nitrogen. Then, once those are taken up, they're further modified either by other bacteria, and then they can be taken up by plants, and the plants can use them to build things like proteins. That nitrogen then found in the plants can be passed to the primary consumers, the secondary, and the tertiary consumers. And then once those animals either defecate or eliminate waste through urination, there's a lot of nitrogen found in the waste. And then also when these organisms die, then that will be broken down by the soil bacteria to convert it back into nitrogen gas. The nitrogen then returns to the atmosphere. So we basically have two sets of bacteria that are either fixing nitrogen into a usable format for living things or sending it back into the atmosphere. So it's a common cycle that we go around and around, basically pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere. It cycles through the living things and then gets put back into the atmosphere. And so the reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. It's in the air. However, we are messing with this cycle a bit because nitrogen is also very common in a lot of fertilizers. And so putting the fertilizers down, especially too much of a fertilizer, it can run off and it can disrupt the nitrogen cycle in various wildlife populations, which can actually cause major problems for those organisms living there. So when we're looking at things like nitrogen and whatnot, we're looking at some of the biggest limiting factors for plant growth. Another thing that's required is phosphorus. Soil and rock are the major sources for phosphorus in the form of phosphates. That's basically PO4, so one phosphate or one phosphorus and 4 oxygens. It has a -3 charge. And this is another limiting factor for plant growth. It's pretty fast though, because as the dead organisms decompose and return to the soil, it goes right back. But there's a slower way of doing that, and that's the formation of rock. So forming rock takes a really long time. That's going to be a slower side to the phosphorus cycle, but basically cycling through organisms between the living and the dead will be a much faster way to filter phosphorus through the cycle. And then once we have the rock built up, erosion can then break down the rock into the phosphate molecules again. Now, phosphorus is extremely important for living things because we find it in DNA, RNA, and ATP, basically every nucleic acid, because if you look at the backbone, right, if you look at the backbones of DNA and RNA, phosphate is making up half of that backbone, and then ATP, adenosine triphosphate, there's 3 phosphates for every single ATP molecule. So if you look at the bases, you're looking at 6 billion bases per cell, right? Because you have 1 phosphate for every nucleotide. So 6 billion nucleotides per cell, that's 10 trillion DNA containing cells per human. With 7.6, 7.7 billion humans, that's 24 million kilograms of phosphorus in the human DNA alone. Fertilizer has a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus. Like I mentioned on the nitrogen cycle slide, when we disrupt that, usually through fertilizer, when there's too much fertilizer put down, rainwater or watering of the plants washes the excess fertilizer into bodies of water, and so we see eutrophication. And this is basically there's too many nutrients put into a given location in a given period of time, and it causes a cascade effect. Basically, algae will consume that high amount of nitrogen and phosphorus really fast, and you'll see what we call pond scum on the surface of still water. But then the algae will die because it'll eventually run out of nutrients. It'll explode in growth. We won't have any more nutrients added in, and so they'll die either because they ran out or maybe also seasonally. It's going to be broken down by bacteria. The bacteria is going to use up the oxygen and add CO2 to the water. That's going to cause the water to become acidic because when water and CO2 are added together, this forms carbonic acid. And that can suffocate things like fish, amphibians, insects, it's extremely destructive to have a boom of certain nutrients in a given environment. We want certain resources to be somewhat limited to maintain the balance. Otherwise, if it gets out of whack, then you can see certain organisms exploding in growth and basically smothering out the rest. And if it gets too bad, the ecosystem may or may not recover, right? There's a possibility that the entire ecosystem just collapses. So make sure in the textbook, if you want a little more insight, to read about dead zone and the Gulf of Mexico in the street bio, page 596. So this is a good figure showing eutrophication. Basically, nutrients increase too fast, too much. Usually nitrogen, phosphorus. Algae and bacteria grow really quickly in these aquatic ecosystems. They're going to consume basically most, if not all, of the oxygen, which is going to basically kill off all the other organisms. And so in these areas where we see we call like these algal blooms, we will literally see hundreds, if not thousands, sometimes millions of organisms just dead, right? These fish literally are just dead, floating in the water, basically suffocated to death. And their entire environment turned acidic, and they suffocated. They had no oxygen to consume. So this is a big issue, especially in lakes in Asia, in Europe, and here in North America as well.